Good morning.
Good morning.
So today, instead of preaching on the Lazarus passage, which is so famous, I'm going to preach on another famous passage, the vision of Ezekiel. I mean, most of us, when we know anything from Ezekiel, it is this passage that we read today about the valley of dry bones. So, this is the story before we get to the valley of the dry bones. It is 6th century BCE, and the northern kingdom has already been taken away by the Assyrians back in the 8th century. The Assyrians had come and demolished Samaria, which was the capital, and the 10 tribes that lived up there were scattered throughout the empire. And then the Babylonians in the 6th century came and destroyed Assyria, and then they looked at that little tiny kingdom that was left called the Kingdom of Judah, and they destroyed the temple at Jerusalem, took away the elite, and took them all the way to Babylon. And so here we have a people who are living in exile by the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And you know, back in those days, in ancient times, religion and land were locally related to, meaning Yahweh was at the temple in Jerusalem. And when the temple was destroyed, they didn't know where Yahweh was. How will they worship God when God is what they thought was back in Jerusalem? So you know that song that we sing? Well, we don't sing it very often, but you've heard it, right? By the rivers of Babylon, when we lay down and cried, when we remember Zion. And then later on in that psalm, they said, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a real question. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Because in those ancient times, in the Iron Age, people imagined their gods as locally bound to the land and to the temple. And here they were, in the land of Babylon, with that great big ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, the god of the Babylonians. This great big ziggurat, you've heard of it, the Tower of Babel. Babel, short for Babylon, and also a play on words for confusion. The Tower of Babel, the ziggurat of confusion. And they were confused. How were they to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Because now they live under the shadow of this ziggurat that from every vantage point in Babylon, they could see it. And it would proclaim to every Babylonian, our God reigns. And it would proclaim to every exile, you have no God to come save you. This is Marduk's domain. So Ezekiel, I imagine him going to the banks of the Tigris and sitting there and weeping. How do we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? So I imagine him falling asleep, and suddenly he has a vision. Yahweh has met him at the banks of the Tigris. And Yahweh takes him by the hand and places him back in Judah. This is a transgression of domain. Yahweh has come into the territory of Marduk. This is a revolution of understanding. A God can travel outside of their domain. And what does Yahweh do? Yahweh places him in a valley of skeletons, in a valley of the dead. And this was not the kind of homecoming Ezekiel was thinking about when he longed for home. And Yahweh said, walk around and look at the skeletons. And Ezekiel probably didn't want to. These were his friends. These were his family. Did the dead still wear the jewelry in which they were wearing when they were? What were other items scattered around the valley of dry bones? And as Ezekiel stood in the valley and the heated wind passed through, it did not hearken life. It only preserved the dead in the scorched whiteness of the bones. What did it hearken to? It hearkened to annihilation and forgetting. The death of a culture, the death of a religion, the death of a people. And God said, walk and look. Mortal one, shall these bones live? And Ezekiel, he's like, well, I feel like the metrics aren't good for a positive answer here, so I'm just going to play the agnostic. Well, you know, Lord, you know. And God said, prophesy. Prophesy to the skeletons. Prophesy to the bones. You know, one of the great things about being a prophet is you don't always have to understand before you obey. You don't have to understand what you're doing and whether it's going to work, and you just follow. And so Ezekiel the prophet just followed before he understood. And so he prophesied to the bones. And then they started rattling. Bone on bone, sinew wrapping the bones, and then stood among those thousands and thousands and thousands of slain, bodies alive, but not totally alive. There's something in their eyes. They hadn't yet, something wrong. And then God said, O mortal one, prophesy to the breath. And in the speaking of life, Ezekiel dared to speak life, the life of God, the breath of God, merged with his breath, so that it was one created breath, one breath that brought a whole new creation. And then the people quickened. And this was a vision of a homecoming, far, maybe not too far, in the future, where Israel, who as a nation thought they were annihilated, a culture annihilated, a religion annihilated, was given a promise of restoration, of a homecoming. One day, this will happen. And it did, right? We know this. We know that Israel was restored, and the Persian Empire came through and they destroyed Babylon, and Cyrus the Great sent them home. And that Tower of Marduk, that ziggurat of confusion, Yahweh went and took a look and walked around and said, it will come down. It will come down. The center of this empire will come down. But how were the people to have known, to have trusted, to believe in hope? How would Ezekiel have known to believe that prophesying and obeying before understanding? How would he have been able to trust? How do we, who watch war after war, devastation after devastation, how are we to trust that there is hope? That there could be a time where there will be building up rather than tearing down. Look at the details. The metrics are good. O mortal, shall these bones live? And yet, the prophet Ezekiel did not understand before he trusted. He did not understand before he obeyed. He did not know before he spoke. And in the speaking of hope, in the announcing of a vision of restoration, the breath of God, the force that creates, merged with his breath, and will bring a new creation. So do not forget that you have a voice. You can speak. And in the trust before knowing, the trust before understanding, the breath of God can merge with your breath to announce hope in the valley of the dead. Amen.